The day Eliza Chandler walked into the Rattlesnake Creek Assay office with a canvas sack slung over one shoulder and fire burning behind her eyes, every man in that dusty room made the mistake of looking straight through her. It was the summer of 1879, and the Nevada high desert was the kind of place that ate men whole and spat out their boot leather. Rattlesnake Creek had sprung up overnight the way these boom towns did, wooden storefronts hammered together from green lumber that warped in the heat, tents still pitched in the alleys between them, and mud in the street that never quite dried because too many boots churned it up too fast. The silver rush that had already made Virginia City famous was sending its tremors outward in every direction, and Rattlesnake Creek sat on the edge of that trembling earth like a man leaning over a cliff and smiling about it. Eliza was 31 years old. She had dark auburn hair that the desert sun had threaded with copper, and she wore it pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to her late husband, Thomas, before the fever took him 14 months ago. Thomas had been a good man in the way that plain bread is good, sustaining, honest, and not particularly exciting. She had loved him and she had buried him, and she had spent every day since making sure his death had not also buried her. She had 2 children at home in the care of her neighbor, Mrs. Poole. Her son, Samuel, was 8 years old and already showing Thomas's steady, quiet nature. Her daughter, Clara, was 5 and showed nobody's nature but her own. Eliza had left them that morning with a kiss on each forehead and a promise to be home before supper, and she had ridden the 11 miles to Rattlesnake Creek on the back of their old roan mare with the canvas sack between her knees. The sack held rock, but not just any rock. 3 weeks earlier, while digging out the corner post of a broken fence line on the western edge of the small homestead she and Thomas had staked in 1874, she had pulled up a fist-sized piece of quartz shot through with veins so bright they made her squint. She had not said a word to anyone. She had wrapped it in her apron and carried it inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, turning it in her hands while Samuel and Clara slept. Then she had gone back to that fence post the next morning, and the morning after that, digging carefully, taking samples from different angles, wrapping each piece in cloth and storing them in the locked chest under the bed where Thomas had kept his extra ammunition. She was not a geologist. She was not a mining man. But she had lived in Nevada for 5 years, and she had listened when men talked in the mercantile and the church and the street, and she had read everything she could lay her hands on, because reading was the only education available to a woman who had come west with $40, a husband, and a great deal of determination. She knew what silver ore looked like. She knew what gold ore looked like, and she knew that what she had pulled out of that fence post hole looked like both. So she had packed the best samples into the canvas sack, hitched the roan, and ridden to the only assay office within reasonable distance. The assay office was run out of a narrow building squeezed between the hardware store and the land title office on Rattlesnake Creek's Main Street, which had no official name, but which everyone called Dust Road with zero affection. The front door was propped open with a horseshoe. Inside, behind a long counter fitted with scales and acid bottles and the particular organized clutter of a man who takes his measurements very seriously, stood the assayer. His name, she would learn in short order, was Homer Hayes. He was 35 years old, lean and brown from years of working in and around mines, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of hands that were permanently stained around the fingernails from handling ore samples and chemical reagents. He wore a canvas work apron over a collarless shirt, and he had a pair of spectacles pushed up onto his forehead that he kept forgetting were there. He was not a flashy man. He did not carry a gun on his hip the way the miners and cowboys did. He carried a small notebook in his breast pocket, and a tendency toward silence that some people read as coldness, and that was actually just the habit of a man who thought carefully before he spoke. When Eliza walked through that propped-open door, Homer Hayes was in the middle of explaining his findings to a group of 4 men who had apparently been in that room when she walked in. There was a broad man named Calhoun in a buffalo hide coat, and two brothers called the Dempsey boys who were neither boys nor possessed of any manners, and a fourth man she did not know who stood in the corner chewing something slowly and watching everything with small dark eyes. All four of them were waiting on assay results that Homer was laying out carefully on the counter. She walked to the counter and set her canvas sack down with a thud that made the scales rattle. Every head in the room turned. Calhoun looked at her the way men in the territory sometimes looked at women who appeared without escorts, not with cruelty, exactly, but with a dismissive quality, a quick visual assessment followed by the mental filing of her under not relevant. "Ma'am," Calhoun said, in the tone of a man who is technically using a polite word but means something else entirely. "Office is occupied." "I see that," Eliza said pleasantly. "I also see it's an assay office open to any person who needs assaying done." "I'll wait my turn." She moved to the side wall and stood with her back to the rough planks and her sack at her feet, and she watched Homer Hayes with steady dark eyes. Homer had looked up when she came in. He had been in the middle of a sentence, and the sentence had died somewhere between his mouth and the air, not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the particular way that hard life and genuine character produce something better than simple prettiness, but because there was something about the way she carried herself that his brain registered before the rest of him caught up. She walked like a woman who was going somewhere and had already decided what would happen when she arrived. He recovered himself quickly and finished his explanation to Calhoun and the Dempsey brothers. The results were not especially good. The ore samples they had brought in were low grade, more schist than silver, and Calhoun took the news with the thick silence of a man containing his temper by main force. The brothers took it less quietly. There was a brief, heated exchange during which Homer held his ground with the calm patience of a man who has had this argument dozens of times and knows exactly how it ends. Eventually, all four men left, Calhoun last, pulling the door shut behind him with a firmness that was as close as he was willing to come to slamming it. And then there was quiet and the sound of the street outside, and Homer turned to the counter and looked at Eliza Chandler properly for the first time. "I apologize for the wait," he said. "No need," she said, and she picked up her canvas sack and carried it to the counter. "I appreciate a man who gives straight information even when it's unwelcome." Homer's mouth almost made a smile. "It doesn't make for much repeat business." "No," she agreed, "but it makes for an honest one." She set the sack on the counter and untied the top. "I have samples from the western edge of a claim outside town. Homestead claim, registered 1874, holder Thomas P. Chandler, now deceased. I am his widow and the claim transfers by law. I need a full analysis, precious metals specifically." He said nothing for a moment, just looked at the top of the sack. Then he looked at her face. "You dug these yourself?" "I did." "From what depth?" 3 to 6 feet mostly. The surface material was unremarkable. The zone begins at about 2.5 feet and deepens toward the northwest as far as I can tell from my sampling. I took 9 specimens. She reached into the sack and began placing the wrapped cloth parcels on the counter, unwrapping each one with the careful, methodical manner of a woman who has thought about what she is doing. "I labeled each one with the approximate coordinates within the area so you can track where they originate." Homer stared at her. She had labeled them. She had tracked coordinates. She had noted a directional tendency in the ore zone. He had been assaying ore samples for 11 years, first in Colorado, then in Utah, now in Nevada, and he could count on one hand the number of prospectors, male or female, professional or amateur, who had done the preparatory work she had just described. He pulled his spectacles down off his forehead and put them on and leaned over the first sample. The color hit him immediately. He picked it up without speaking and turned it under the light from the window. He turned it again. He set it down and picked up the second sample, then the third. The silence stretched out long enough that Eliza felt the first genuine flutter of anxiety she had permitted herself since she had found the initial piece. She kept her face composed, but her hands, which she had clasped on the counter, tightened slightly. "Mrs. Chandler," Homer said at last, and his voice had changed in a way she noticed without being able to name. "How many people know you brought these in today?" "My neighbor knows I came to town. She doesn't know why. Your children, they're 8 and 5, know. Anyone else?" She watched him. "Why are you asking?" Homer straightened and looked at her directly. His eyes behind those spectacles were a shade of gray-green that she would later think of as the color of sage in morning light. "Because I need to do full acid tests and a fire assay to give you exact numbers, but based on visual examination alone, these specimens are carrying silver and gold both. The gold content in this third sample," he tapped it, "is visible to the naked eye if you know what you're looking at. That makes this particular claim potentially quite valuable, and in a town like this one, that information travels faster than cholera and causes nearly as much damage." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "How long for the full tests?" "I can have preliminary results by tomorrow noon, full report by day after tomorrow. And in the meantime, I keep my mouth shut," Homer said simply. "That's a part of the service that doesn't appear in any written policy, but it has always been my practice. What you bring in here is your business until you decide otherwise." She studied him for a long moment with the particular focused attention of a woman who has learned that the world will take from her everything it can, and that careful reading of character is an essential survival skill. He met her gaze without flinching, without that slightly uncomfortable look that some men got when a woman looked at them too directly, as though directness itself were an inappropriate intimacy. "All right," she said. "I'll come back tomorrow afternoon." She turned to leave, and then she stopped. "Mr." She looked at the name board on the wall. "Hayes, what is the fee for the full analysis?" $2 for the complete report." She reached into her coat pocket and put $2 silver on the counter. He made no move to sweep them away as some men might have, no gesture suggesting she could pay when she came back, no implication that the money was somehow less important than the information. He simply took the coins, wrote her a receipt in his careful script, and handed it to her. She took it, folded it, and put it in her pocket. "Tomorrow afternoon," she said. "Tomorrow afternoon," he agreed. She walked out through the propped-open door and into the heat of the Rattlesnake Creek afternoon, and Homer Hayes stood at his counter for a long moment after she had gone, looking at the 9 carefully wrapped and labeled samples and feeling, with the particular certainty of a man who deals in precise measurements, that something significant had just walked through his door. He picked up the third sample again and held it to the window. "Well," he said quietly to no one in particular. And then he put on his work gloves and began. The 11-mile ride home gave Eliza time to think, which was both useful and dangerous. The roan moved steadily on the packed desert trail, and the late afternoon sun turned the scrub and the red rock the color of embers, and Eliza sat straight in the saddle and ran through every scenario she could construct. If the ore was as good as Homer Hayes's face had suggested, then she owned a silver and gold deposit on a homestead claim, which meant that the mineral rights were bound up in the property claim, and which also meant that Rattlesnake Creek's various interests, the mining concerns, the claim jumpers, the men in buffalo hide coats with limited patience, would all become keenly interested in a widow woman sitting alone on a productive piece of land with 2 small children and no husband. Thomas had been gone 14 months. The homestead had given them enough to live on, barely, because Eliza worked it with the relentless quiet efficiency that she brought to everything, but barely was the operative word. She had sold 2 of their 4 original horses. She had taken in sewing through the winter. She had made decisions at the table at night in the lamplight that Thomas had never had to make, and she had made them clearly and without flinching, because the alternative was unacceptable. She was not afraid of hard work or hard choices, but she was also not naive. She knew that a woman alone, even a woman with a valid legal claim, was an easier target than a woman with allies. She would need to think very carefully about what came next. When she got home, Samuel was helping Mrs. Poole carry water from the well, which he did with a serious, focused expression that always squeezed something tender in her chest. Clara was sitting on the porch steps with a rag doll, conducting what appeared to be a trial of some kind, alternately playing the judge and the defendant and finding the defendant repeatedly guilty. "Mama," Clara announced without looking up, "this doll stole my other doll's hat and she is going to jail." "Is she being given a fair hearing?" Eliza asked, dismounting and tying the roan to the post. Clara considered this. Somewhat. Mrs. Poole appeared in the doorway. She was 62 years old and had been in Nevada since 1866, and had survived 2 husbands and a mine collapse, and had the particular durable quality of someone who has stopped expecting the world to be easy. She looked at Eliza with the sharp eyes of a woman who notices things. "You look like you found something," Mrs. Poole said. "I had a useful day in town," Eliza said carefully. Mrs. Poole held her gaze for a moment and then nodded. She would not press. It was one of the reasons Eliza trusted her. "Supper's on the stove," she said. "Come inside." That night, after the children were in bed, Eliza sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's old land documents spread before her. She had gone through them before, many times, but now she read them with new attention. The claim was registered properly. The transfer on Thomas's death had been documented through the county recorder, who had been less helpful about it than he should have been, but it was done, and it was legal. She owned the land, and under Nevada law in 1879, the mineral rights of an unpatented homestead claim were a complicated question. The Mineral Lands Leasing Act and the General Mining Law of 1872 created a legal landscape that favored whoever could work the claim and hold it. She needed that assay report, and she needed to move quickly after she had it. She blew out the lamp and went to bed, and she lay in the dark listening to the desert wind against the cabin walls and the small sounds of her children sleeping in the other room, and she thought about the color of ore samples in afternoon light, and about a pair of gray-green eyes behind wire-framed spectacles. She told herself firmly that the eyes were irrelevant. She rode back to Rattlesnake Creek the next afternoon, leaving the children with Mrs. Poole again and taking the roan at a brisker pace than usual. She arrived on Dust Road a little before 3 o'clock and tied the mare to the rail outside the Assay office and pushed through the door. Homer was alone this time. He was writing at his desk behind the counter, and he looked up when she came in with that quality she was already beginning to recognize, not exactly surprise, because he seemed like a man who didn't startle easily, but a kind of attention that sharpened and focused. "Mrs. Chandler," he said. He put down his pen and stood. "I was hoping you'd come before the end of the day. I have the preliminary results, and they are—" He paused, and she saw something cross his face that might have been wonder if it were translated from the language of a reserved and careful man. "They are exceptional." He carried a folder to the counter and opened it. He had written his analysis in a neat, close hand, with numbered columns for each sample. She looked at the numbers and then looked up at him. "The fire assay puts the silver content at an average of 212 ounces per ton across the 9 samples," Homer said quietly. "The gold runs lower but is present in 6 of the 9 specimens. The best sample," he touched it on the counter where it lay, "tested at 31 ounces of gold per ton." Eliza was still for a moment. She knew enough to understand what those numbers meant. 200 ounces of silver per ton was not a marginal claim. It was not a poor man scraping. It was, if the ore body was of any significant size at all, a producing mine. "The full report will be ready tomorrow," Homer continued. "But I wanted you to have the preliminary numbers today because—" He stopped. "Because," she prompted. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense of a man choosing his words carefully, not because he was calculating, but because he was genuinely trying to say something true. "Because in my experience, the time between a significant find and word of it getting out is much shorter than people expect, and I think you should be prepared." "Calhoun," she said. Homer looked at her steadily. "He came back this morning. Wanted to know who the woman was who'd come in yesterday." "What did you tell him?" "That I had no record of anyone coming in. which is technically true because the receipt I wrote you has no name on it. I only wrote the amount and the date. That was also deliberate on my part, Mrs. Chandler, in case you were wondering." She looked at him. "Why would you do that?" He met her eyes with a directness that matched her own. "Because you paid for an honest service, and protecting the confidentiality of the person who paid for it is part of providing it." He paused. "And because Calhoun already has 3 registered claims and doesn't need another, and the law is on your side if you can hold your position." Eliza folded her hands on the counter. "What would you recommend, as the person who knows this territory and the legal landscape better than I do?" Homer was quiet for a moment. "You need to file an amendment to your homestead claim specifically noting mineral activity. That puts the mining interest on record under your name before anyone else can file a competing notice. The land office will try to make it difficult." His jaw tightened slightly. "Because you're a woman, and because they tend to favor established commercial interests. But the law is clear, and if you walk in with a documented assay report and the original claim papers and someone who knows how to read a legal document, they have no grounds to refuse. And you know how to read a legal document. I have had occasion to help other claim holders navigate the land office," he said, "and I am willing to help you if you want it." She studied him again with that long, reading look. "Why?" The question was blunt, and it landed between them in the quiet office, and Homer did not look away from it. He thought, and she waited, and the afternoon light came through the dusty window and lay across the counter between them. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said at last, "and because I have been in this territory long enough to know that the right thing does not happen by itself. It requires someone to push for it." Eliza Chandler looked at Homer Hayes for a long moment, and something shifted in her chest that she didn't name and wouldn't name for quite some time yet. It was not the dramatic, lightning strike thing that stories described. It was quieter than that. It was the particular feeling of recognition, of meeting someone whose grain runs the same direction as yours, and it was enough to make her draw a slow breath and look down at the assay report and then look back up. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow, after the full report is done, we go to the land office together. I'll be ready at 9, he said. She tucked the preliminary report into her coat. "Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Chandler." She walked out into the bright Rattlesnake Creek afternoon, and this time Homer stood at his window and watched the roan mare carry her out of sight down the road, and he was quiet for a long time after. The land office of Rattlesnake Creek was presided over by a man named Garrett Sims, who had the well-fed look of someone who considered himself very important in a small space, and who had a habit of stroking his side whiskers when he was about to refuse something. He stroked them the moment Eliza and Homer walked through the door the following morning. Now, Sims said, in the particular tone of a man who says now as a substitute for engaging with what is actually being presented to him. "Mrs. Chandler, a mining amendment on a homestead claim is a complicated matter. There are surveys required. There are notices that need to be posted. There is a waiting period." "Under the General Mining Law of 1872, Homer said, placing the full assay report and the original claim papers on Sims' desk with the precise, unhurried motion of a man who has done his preparation and knows it. "A homestead claimant who discovers valuable mineral deposits on their existing claim may amend the claim to include mineral interest by filing a notice with documentation of the discovery. The documentation here includes a certified assay report from a licensed assayer. That is me. My license is number 4417 issued by the Territory of Nevada, and the original claim registration dated 1874. The claim is in good standing. Mrs. Chandler is the registered successor holder. There is no procedural reason to delay." Sims stroked his whiskers with considerable vigor. "There is also," Homer continued in the same measured tone, "no legal basis for a competing claim to be filed on registered land that is already in active use, which this homestead demonstrably is. If such a claim were to be filed, and I am aware that at least one inquiry about this land has already been made to this office in the past 48 hours. It would be subject to immediate legal challenge." Sim's hand dropped from his whiskers. He looked at Homer, and then at Eliza, and he found in both cases a quality of calm certainty that was harder to push against than outright aggression would have been. "The filing fee is $3, Sim said, in the tone of a man accepting defeat while trying to make it look like a business transaction. Eliza put $3 on the desk without a word. They walked out of the land office 40 minutes later with a stamped and dated amendment notice and a receipt, and Eliza stood on the boardwalk in the morning sun and let out a breath that she had been holding for 3 days. "It will hold?" she asked. "It will hold," Homer said. "They can contest it, but the law is on your side. You'd want an attorney to review everything before you take the next steps, actually developing the claim, negotiating with any mining company that comes calling. There's a good one in Carson City named Whitfield. I can write you a letter of introduction." Eliza turned to look at him. He was standing beside her on the boardwalk with his hands in his coat pockets, squinting slightly against the morning glare, and he looked exactly like what he was, a careful, honest man who had done a careful, honest thing and expected nothing particular in return for it. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "Homer," he said, and then looked briefly startled as though the word had come out before he had decided to offer it. "That is, if you prefer." "Homer," she said, testing it. "Thank you, not for the service, although that too, for treating this as something worth fighting for." He was quiet for a moment. "It was worth fighting for," he said simply. They were standing in the morning light on the main street of a rough boom town in the Nevada desert, surrounded by the noise of hammers and horses and the thousand small sounds of a place being built out of nothing by people who had nothing to lose, and Eliza felt, for the first time in 14 months, that the ground beneath her feet was genuinely solid. She turned back to look at the land office. "I suppose I should send word to the attorney in Carson City." "I'll write the letter today," Homer said. "You can pick it up tomorrow, or I can send it by post directly if you'd rather not make the trip again." She looked at him sideways. "I don't mind the trip." And she realized, even as she said it, that this was entirely true. The summer turned, and the weeks passed, and the events that followed the filing of the amendment notice moved with the particular combination of slowness and sudden speed that characterized legal and commercial affairs in the Nevada Territory in 1879. Calhoun did indeed attempt a competing claim filing, and was refused on the grounds that Homer had anticipated, and came into the Assay office 3 days later in a cold fury that was more dangerous than hot fury because it was controlled. He stood at the counter and looked at Homer with flat, deliberate eyes and said nothing for a long moment. "The widow's claim," he said finally. "You helped her." "I provided assay services and accurate information," Homer said. "You went with her to the land office." "I accompanied a client to ensure that the documentation I certified was presented correctly. That is also a service I provide." Calhoun's eyes didn't move. "You've made an enemy today, Hayes." Homer met the flat gaze without blinking. "I've done my job. If that makes an enemy, then that's the price of doing it right." Calhoun left. Homer finished what he was doing and then sat down at his desk and was still for a while. He was not a reckless man. He had thought about the consequences of helping Eliza Chandler before he had helped her, and he had concluded that the consequences were his to bear and worth bearing. He had been in the West long enough to know that men like Calhoun moved on eventually, to the next claim, the next town, the next opportunity. What they left behind was less permanent than it seemed in the moment. He wrote a letter to Attorney Whitfield in Carson City, and also, without exactly intending to, a second shorter note that he folded and addressed to Mrs. Eliza Chandler, and then sat looking at for a while before folding it again and putting it in his desk drawer. He was not, he told himself, a man who wrote letters to women he had known for 2 weeks. He was a careful, methodical man who measured things precisely and did not leap ahead of the available evidence. He left the letter in the drawer. Eliza came the next day to collect the letter to Whitfield, and she brought Samuel with her, because he had never been to town and had been asking with the patient, persistent asking of a quiet child who never raises his voice but never drops the subject either. Samuel stood very straight and looked at everything with large, serious eyes, and when he saw Homer's assay equipment, the scales, the crucibles, the rows of carefully labeled bottles, he stared with an expression that Homer recognized as the particular hunger of a child who has just found something that speaks directly to whatever they are made of. "Could you tell me how those work?" Samuel asked Homer, in the careful, polite voice of a boy who has been taught good manners and is using them because he genuinely wants something. Homer looked at Eliza. She nodded, with a small smile that did something entirely unreasonable to his composure. He spent 20 minutes explaining the basics of fire assay to Samuel Chandler, who listened with an intensity that most adults did not bring to conversations, and asked 3 questions that were better questions than Homer usually received from grown men. Afterward, as Eliza and Samuel were leaving, Clara's name came up because Samuel mentioned her in passing, and Homer said, "You're welcome to bring your daughter next time if she'd like to see the office." And Eliza laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and said that Clara's interest in chemistry was less guaranteed, but her interest in being included in anything Samuel got to do was absolute. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. He thought about it for several days afterward. The attorney Whitfield came to Rattlesnake Creek in person in late August, which was not what Eliza had expected, but which was, as it turned out, the response of a man who knew a significant case when he saw one. He was a small, precise man of 50 with a Boston education and a sharp eye, and he went over every document Eliza had with a thoroughness that she found both reassuring and slightly exhausting. He met with Homer as well, reviewing the assay methodology and certifications, and after 2 days of meetings he sat down with Eliza in the parlor of the boarding house where she had taken a room for the duration, and told her what she was looking at. What she was looking at was a producing claim of considerable potential value. The assay numbers Homer had certified were strong enough to attract investment. She had 2 options, broadly. She could negotiate a lease with a mining company that would pay her royalties on the extracted ore, or she could seek investment partners to develop the mine herself and retain ownership. "The second option is more complex and requires more capital," Whitfield said, "but it gives you full control. Given your circumstances, a widow with minor children, a homestead that is also your residence, I would advise against inviting a mining company onto the property. They tend to expand beyond agreed boundaries and then argue about it in court. Better to control the development yourself if at all possible." "And if I wanted to pursue that path?" Eliza asked. "You would need investors, legitimate ones with written agreements, and a mine manager, someone with actual experience developing an ore body, which is a different skill from prospecting." Whitfield paused. "Do you know anyone with that kind of background?" Eliza thought about a man who had been in the territory for 11 years, who had worked in Colorado and Utah before Nevada, who knew ore bodies and mining law and the particular mechanics of how rock became revenue. "I might," she said. She went to the assay office the next morning. Homer was there early, as he always was, already at work. He looked up when she came in. "The attorney has given me his assessment," she said without preamble. "He recommends I develop the claim independently rather than lease to a mining company, which means I need a mine manager." Homer was quiet. "I am offering you the position," Eliza said. "Before you say anything, I know this is a significant ask. You have a business here. You have your own work. I'm not asking you to abandon anything. I'm asking whether you might be willing to transition or to help me find the right person if you don't want the role yourself. Your work on the assay gave me the foundation for everything else, and I trust your judgment more than I trust anyone else's on this." Homer took his spectacles off his forehead and set them on the counter and was quiet for a long moment. Eliza waited. She had learned by now that his silences were not empty, they were occupied, in the way that a careful workshop is occupied even when the craftsman seems to be standing still. "The claim will need a proper shaft sunk," he said finally, "timber supports, an arrastra to start, or a small stamp mill if the ore body warrants it. You're looking at 6 months of development work before you see any significant return." "I know. And the money to fund that will need to come from somewhere. Whitfield has identified 2 possible investors in Carson City who have expressed interest based on the preliminary assay numbers." Homer picked up his spectacles and turned them over in his hands. "Mrs. Chandler," he said. "Eliza." She went very still at her name in his voice but kept her expression composed. "I have been the assayer here for 3 years. Before that I spent 8 years working in and around mines in 2 other territories. I came here because I wanted to do work that was precise and clean, and this office has given me that." He paused. "But I have been—" He stopped, and she watched him find the right word, restless, "in ways I haven't known what to do with." "And," she said quietly. He looked at her directly. "And I think what you're building might be the most honest and worthwhile thing I've been asked to be part of in a very long time. So you'll consider it." "I'll do it," he said, "if that's what you're asking." The smile that came to her face was not the careful, controlled expression she usually presented to the world. It was sudden and bright and entirely unguarded, and it hit Homer Hayes somewhere in the vicinity of his sternum with a force that was not at all consistent with the professional nature of the conversation. "That is exactly what I'm asking," she said. The fall of 1879 was busy in the way that building something from the ground up is always busy, full of simultaneous demands and small victories and problems that had to be solved immediately, because there was no one else to solve them. Homer gave 30 days' notice on the assay office. There was another man in Rattlesnake Creek who had been considering setting up a competing operation, and the transition was manageable, and spent those 30 days also helping Eliza negotiate the investor agreements with Whitfield's oversight. The 2 Carson City investors, brothers named Prentice, were satisfied by the assay report and agreed to a written partnership that specified Eliza's ownership stake and her right to operational control. Homer came to the homestead for the first time in early October to assess the site and plan the initial development. He arrived on a gray morning with a measuring rod and a notebook, and spent several hours walking the western edge of the property, examining the ground, calculating angles. Eliza walked with him, and Samuel came too, carrying Homer's pack with an expression of focused pride. Clara came for the first half hour and then found a lizard and transferred her full attention to that. "The ore zone runs roughly northwest from your original discovery point," Homer said, kneeling at the edge of a shallow test pit Eliza had dug, "which is consistent with the samples. The best place for the main shaft is here." He drove a stake into the ground. "It will give us the angle we need to follow the vein downward." "How deep?" Eliza asked. "Impossible to say without sinking it, but the surface indications are good. I've seen worse ground produce steady mines for a decade." She looked at the stake in the hard Nevada soil and felt the thing she had been feeling since she first turned that first piece of quartz in her hands at the kitchen table, a sense of the future being genuinely open, which was a sensation she had almost forgotten. "Thomas never knew," she said quietly. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out on its own. Homer stood and brushed dirt from his knees. "No, we struggled with the homestead from the beginning." He worked himself. She stopped. "He worked harder than any man should have to work, and all this time it was right here." Homer was quiet beside her, looking at the stake. "That's a hard thing to hold." "It is," she agreed, "but I've decided to hold it differently, not as a cruelty, as a gift that came too late for him and on time for me." She looked up and found him watching her with an expression that was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before. No reserve, no careful management of what he was letting show. Just an honest, open regard that went into her chest like warmth after cold. "That takes a great deal of grace," he said. "Or a great deal of stubbornness," she said. I've never been sure which one I have more of. The corner of his mouth lifted. My working hypothesis is that you have a considerable surplus of both. She laughed, and he smiled at the sound of it, and Samuel, who was watching from 3 feet away with the acute observational skills of a child who misses nothing, looked between the two of them with an expression of quiet consideration that was entirely his father's and entirely his own. The winter came fast in the Nevada high desert, and it slowed but did not stop the work. The main shaft went down 12 feet by November, Homer directing the hired men, 2 experienced miners from the depleted Virginia City field who had heard about the Chandler claim and come looking for steady wages, while Eliza managed the books and the supply chain and the ongoing legal business with the meticulous attention that she brought to everything. Homer took a room at the boarding house in Rattlesnake Creek, but he was at the homestead most days from before sunrise to after sunset, and on the evenings when he stayed for supper, which became more evenings than not, almost without either of them acknowledging that this was what was happening. He sat at the kitchen table and went over the day's progress with Eliza and drew the night's calculations in his notebook, while the children did their lessons nearby, and the stove put out the particular warmth of a room that is genuinely occupied and lived in. Clara decided she liked Homer during the 3rd week, which she announced at dinner without any particular ceremony. "I have decided I like you," she told him, pointing at him with her fork. "I am very glad to hear it," Homer said seriously. "Samuel liked you first," Clara added, "but I make my own decisions." "That seems to me a very sound policy," Homer said. Eliza was looking at her plate with an expression that suggested she was fighting a smile, and Homer caught it from the corner of his eye and felt something in his chest that was neither precision nor methodology, but that was, despite his best attempts at professional detachment, becoming harder to ignore. The shaft reached the main ore zone in early December, at 19 feet below the surface. Homer came to the house that evening with dirt on his coat and an expression that she had never seen on him before, a kind of radiance, the particular brightness of a man who deals in evidence and has just received irrefutable evidence of something wonderful. "It's there," he said, standing at the door with his hat in his hands. "The full vein, wider than I estimated, significantly wider." He stopped and seemed to realize that he was standing in the doorway and had not taken his coat off. "I'm sorry I come in," Eliza said, and something in her voice made him go quiet. She stepped back from the door and he came inside, and she took his coat from him without asking, and he stood in the kitchen lamplight looking at her with that open, unguarded expression that he was increasingly unable to manage away. "Eliza," he said. "Homer," she said. The children were in bed. The stove was banked low. The desert wind moved around the outside of the cabin walls with its constant low voice, and inside it was warm and quiet and entirely private. "I should tell you," Homer said and stopped. "Then tell me," she said. He looked at his hands, which were holding the notebook he had brought in without thinking. He looked at it as though he had only just noticed it and set it down on the table. He looked at her. "I have been in this territory for 3 years," he said slowly, "and before that 2 territories before it. I have moved every few years since I was 22, and I have always told myself it was the nature of the work, following the ore bodies, following the next thing." He paused. "But I think the truth is that I was looking for something that I did not know how to name, and every time I didn't find it somewhere I moved on." She was very still, watching him. "I am not moving on from here," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens with the claim, whatever happens with any of it, I'm not looking at this as a job I will finish and then leave." He took a slow breath. "I am not entirely sure I know how to say the rest of this in a way that is, Homer," she said, and the warmth in her voice was a full sentence by itself. "I care for you," he said, "very much. And I know it is too soon, and I know your life is complicated, and I am not asking for anything. I only wanted you to know, because I think you deserve honesty from the people around you, and I have been carrying it around like a stone in my pocket, and it seemed worse to keep it there than to say it outright." Eliza Chandler looked at Homer Hayes in the lamplight of the kitchen, where she had sat alone for 14 months making decisions for herself and her children, and she felt the ground be solid under her feet in a way that was different from the solidness of legal filings and certified documents. This was the solidness of another person standing beside you who intends to stay. "It is not too soon," she said quietly. "I thought it might be. I have spent several months trying to determine whether it was. But I think," she took a breath of her own, "I think there is a difference between moving too fast and simply being sure, and I am sure." He looked at her. "Of what?" "Of you," she said simply. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her hands in his, and they stood in the lamplight with the desert wind outside and the children sleeping in the next room and the ore vein 19 feet below the hard Nevada ground. And he bent his head, and she lifted her face, and he kissed her with the careful, earnest attention that he brought to everything that mattered to him. She kissed him back with everything she had held very carefully for a very long time, and the stone in his pocket was gone, and the particular loneliness that had followed her through 14 months of widow's grief lifted from her shoulders like something physical. And they stood together in the warm kitchen for a long moment after, his forehead against hers, both of them breathing quietly in the particular silence of 2 people who have finally said the true thing. "Well," Homer said softly, which was the same word he had said to himself in the Assay office 3 months ago when he had first held her ore samples to the window. "Well," Eliza agreed and laughed, and he held her hands more tightly. Christmas of 1879 was the first Christmas Eliza had not dreaded since Thomas's death. She made a proper dinner, roast chicken and sweet potatoes and a pie from dried apples, and Homer came, and Mrs. Poole came, and the children had a magnificent day. Homer had made Samuel a small but precisely calibrated balance scale, an exacting piece of craft that Samuel received with the reverent expression of someone receiving exactly the right thing. And he had made Clara a small wooden chest with a latch that locked, for keeping what she called her important things. Clara opened it, placed her 3 most significant rocks inside, locked it, and announced that it was perfect. After dinner, when the children had gone to bed and Mrs. Poole had gone home, Eliza and Homer sat on the porch in the cold, clear desert night, wrapped in wool blankets, looking at the stars that were enormous and very close in the high desert dark. "What will you do," Homer said, "when the mine is producing, really producing the way it will be by next fall?" She thought about it. "I'll have enough to make the homestead genuinely stable," she said. "Enough to give Samuel a real education. There's a good school in Carson City. Enough to give Clara," she paused, thinking of her daughter, "whatever she decides she needs, which I suspect will be considerable and entirely unexpected." Homer laughed quietly. "That is an accurate prediction." "And you?" she asked. "I want to build something permanent," he said. "I've spent 11 years being temporary. I want a place that's mine and a work that's mine." And he stopped. She was looking at him. "A life," he said. "I want an actual life. Here." She reached over and took his hand under the blankets and held it. "Then that is what we'll build," she said. They were not impulsive people. They did not rush. But they were also both people who had lived long enough to know that careful and slow are not the same thing, and that caution applied to the wrong things is its own kind of mistake. By February of 1880, Homer had moved from the boarding house into the small auxiliary room that Thomas had built on the east side of the cabin as a workshop, converted now into proper sleeping quarters, because the practical demands of running a developing mine made it simpler and more sensible, and because neither of them was pretending any more about the direction of things. They were married in April of 1880, on a clear spring day with the desert in bloom, the way it got sometimes, briefly and extravagantly, when the winter rains had been good. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through Rattlesnake Creek every 6 weeks, and attended by Mrs. Poole and Whitfield the attorney, who had made a special trip from Carson City, and 2 of the miners who worked the Chandler claim, and the woman who ran the boarding house, and a number of other residents of Rattlesnake Creek who had formed opinions about the widow Chandler and the Assay, and were deeply invested in the outcome. Samuel stood very straight during the ceremony, wearing his good shirt, with an expression of careful approval. Clara wore a blue dress and had put flowers in her hair and spent the first 10 minutes of the ceremony rearranging them, and then settled into genuine attention when it became clear that the proceedings required it. Homer Hayes looked at Eliza Chandler under the open spring sky and said the words of the ceremony in his quiet, deliberate voice, and his hands holding hers were steady, and his eyes behind his spectacles were very clear and very serious and entirely certain. Eliza looked back at him and felt the full complicated weight of the past 2 years, the grief and the solitude and the hard choices, and the long rides on a roan mare in the desert heat settle into something that was no longer a burden but a foundation. Thomas's death had unmade the life she had built, and she had mourned him properly and completely, and now she was building something new on the same ground, literally, and the ground was richer than anyone had known. "I do," she said, and meant it with every available part of herself. The mine was running at full capacity by October of 1880. They had brought in a small stamp mill in August, and the sound of it running was a constant presence on the property, a rhythmic mechanical heartbeat that Eliza had come to find oddly reassuring in the same way that she found reassuring any sound that meant things were working. The ore body had proven even more substantial than Homer's initial estimate. They were extracting ore that averaged, across the full operation, 180 ounces of silver per ton, slightly below the exceptional preliminary numbers, but well above what was needed for strong profitability. The Prentice brothers in Carson City were receiving their returns and had proposed a second investment round for expanded operations, which Whitfield was reviewing. Eliza managed the finances with an exactitude that impressed Whitfield, who had reviewed the books of a great many mining operations in his career, and rarely found them as clear and accurate as these. She had an instinct for numbers that she had never had occasion to fully develop before, and which now found its full expression in the ledgers that she kept in the same locked chest where she had once stored ore samples, and which showed, by the end of 1880, a profit that was more than she had thought possible when she had ridden into Rattlesnake Creek alone with a canvas sack over her shoulder. Calhoun left the territory in the summer of 1880. No one spoke much about why or where, and Eliza did not ask. What she did was work, and love her children, and love her husband, and build the life she had promised herself on a cold porch under Nevada stars. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was a quiet one on the homestead, which had been expanded and improved through the year into something that was no longer the struggling claim it had been, but a proper working enterprise, the cabin enlarged with a real parlor and a second bedroom for the children. The mine workings to the west with their own small structure for the equipment and the workers' tools. The roan mare joined now by 3 younger horses that Homer had selected with as much care as he applied to everything. Samuel turned 9 and then 10, and his absorption in the assay work and the mine operations deepened into something that was clearly not a passing interest but a genuine vocation. Homer had begun teaching him in earnest, the way one craftsman teaches another, not simplifying things because of age, but calibrating the instruction to what the child could genuinely absorb, which turned out to be quite a lot. Samuel could read a scale and calculate ore yield by the time he was 10, and he did it with a quiet pleasure that was the same quiet pleasure Homer brought to the same work, and watching them together at the makeshift assay bench Homer had built in the workshop was one of the private joys of Eliza's daily life. Clara, who had turned 7 and showed no signs of becoming less herself, had developed an intense interest in horses and a secondary intense interest in the legal documents that were periodically sent from Whitfield's office, which she would carry around and pretend to read with an authority that was both absurd and, in some way that Eliza recognized with a private smile, entirely plausible. In early 1881, Eliza realized she was expecting. She told Homer on a Sunday morning in February, before the children were up, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between them and the gray morning light coming through the window. She told him simply and directly, because she was not a woman who constructed elaborate moments, and he sat very still for a beat, and then his face did the thing it sometimes did when something mattered too much for his usual composure. It simply showed everything all at once, undisguised and entirely clear. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his. "How are you feeling?" "Very well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but nothing serious." "We should get Mrs. Poole involved early," he said. "And there's a physician in Carson City." "Homer," she said gently. He stopped. "I have done this twice before," she said. "I know what I'm doing." He looked at her, and the worry in his face was overlaid by something else. The trust he had built for her over the past year and a half, the knowledge of who she was and what she was capable of. He nodded. "You do," he said. "But I would like the Carson City physician as well," she added, "just to be practical." He squeezed her hands. "I'll write to him tomorrow." The summer of 1881 was long and warm and full of the small, particular richness of a life that is genuinely working. The mine continued to produce. Samuel turned 11 and began keeping his own notebooks, precise and detailed, in a hand that was already beginning to look like Homer's. Clara turned 8 and decided she wanted to learn to shoot, which prompted a family discussion that Eliza won with the argument that practical skills were practical skills, and which resulted in Homer teaching Clara to handle a rifle in the safe, careful way he did everything, while Clara proved to have a natural precision that startled all of them. Eliza's pregnancy was straightforward, which she had expected, and in August of 1881 she gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas, because it was right to do so, and Homer agreed to this without reservation or awkwardness, because he was the kind of man who understood that honoring what came before was not the same as being bound by it. Thomas Hayes came into the world in the bedroom of the expanded cabin with Mrs. Poole attending, and the Carson City physician present, and Homer standing very close to where Eliza could reach his hand whenever she needed to, which was a position he maintained with complete and absolute stillness for however long it took. When it was done, and Eliza held the baby and looked up at Homer, his face was doing the thing she loved most about it, entirely open, entirely present, every feeling showing plain. "He's perfect," Homer said. His voice was rough. "He is," Eliza agreed. Samuel came in first and looked at his new brother with the considered expression of someone conducting a careful evaluation, and then his face broke into a smile that was rare from him, and therefore precious. Clara came in second, and was immediately and completely enchanted in a way that suggested she was going to be both an excellent and an extremely overbearing older sister, and there was no useful distinction between those two things. The rest of 1881 passed in the comfortable fullness of a household that is simultaneously busy in content. The mine operated, the books balanced, the children grew. The marriage deepened in the way that marriages do when two people who are genuinely compatible share genuine work and genuine difficulty and genuine joy, not in dramatic peaks, but in the accumulated weight of daily choosing, daily honesty, daily care. Homer had a habit, in the evenings after the children were in bed, of sitting in the parlor with his notebook and his calculations, and Eliza had a habit of sitting across from him with her ledger, or the letter she was writing, or the book she was reading. And the silence between them was the particular productive silence of two people who are comfortable enough in each other's presence to simply be present, without performance or requirement. He would sometimes look up from his notebook and find her already looking at him, and she would smile, unhurriedly, and he would smile back, and no words were necessary because the language they had developed between them over 2 years of hard work and honesty and love was not primarily verbal. In the spring of 1882, they received word from Whitfield that a larger mining concern based in San Francisco had approached the Prentice brothers about purchasing their investment stake in the Chandler operation. This was, Whitfield wrote carefully, an opportunity worth evaluating, but Eliza should understand that accepting it would bring a larger corporate interest into the operation and potentially change the terms of her control. Homer read the letter twice and then handed it across the table to Eliza, who read it once and set it down. "I'm not interested in selling control," she said. "Nor am I," Homer said. "Whitfield thinks we should at least hear the San Francisco offer." "Whitfield is a good attorney and a cautious man," Homer said, "both of which are useful qualities. We should hear the offer, evaluate it professionally, and decline it if it compromises the operation's independence." Eliza looked at him across the table. "You know that declining a San Francisco mining company's advances is not without consequences." "I know," Homer said, "but those consequences are manageable. The mine is producing at capacity. The claim is legally solid. We are not dependent on outside investment anymore. We were initially, but the operating returns have more than covered the original debt to the Prentice brothers. If they want to sell their stake, we can buy it ourselves." She blinked. "Can we?" "Yes," he said, and pulled his notebook over and showed her the numbers. She leaned over the table to look at them, and he talked her through the calculation with the quiet, clear voice he used when he was explaining something he knew well, and she followed it with the quick numerical facility she had developed over 2 years of running a producing mine, and at the end of it she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "We can buy them out," she said. "We can buy them out," he confirmed. She looked at him. "Homer Hayes, you have been carrying this calculation around for how long?" "A few weeks," he admitted. "I wanted to be certain before I mentioned it." She shook her head slowly, with a smile that was wide and warm and entirely private. "You are the most careful man I have ever known." "I prefer thorough," he said, with the particular small dignity he brought to his own self-description. "Thorough," she agreed, and reached across the table and put her hand on his, and he turned it and held it in that way he had, that warm, firm, unhurried holding that communicated more than most people communicated in paragraphs. They bought out the Prentice brothers in June of 1882. The papers were signed in Whitfield's office in Carson City, with Eliza and Homer both present, and when it was done and the documents were folded away in her document case, Eliza Chandler Hayes stood on the steps of Whitfield's office in Carson City, Nevada, in the afternoon of a June day, and she was the sole majority owner of a producing silver and gold mine that had come out of a fence post-hole, and 3 weeks of careful solitary work in the desert. And she had arrived here by exactly the path she had chosen, and for exactly the reasons she had decided on, and everything was exactly as it should be. Homer stood beside her on the steps, his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the street. "Well," he said, which was, she had come to understand, the word he used when the evidence was simply overwhelming and no other word would do it justice. "Well," she agreed. She took his arm and they walked out into the afternoon. They sent Samuel to the school in Carson City in the fall of 1882, which was a significant transition that Eliza handled by writing him a letter every week without fail, and which Samuel handled by making friends quickly and methodically, and writing back with the precise, detailed correspondence of a child who takes communication seriously. He came home for Christmas and Easter and the long summer, and he spent the summers working alongside Homer in the mine operation, learning the practical realities of ore extraction and processing, with the earnest, focused engagement that was entirely his own. Clara, who was now 9 and had strong opinions about a great many things, decided the following year that she too would like to go to the Carson City School, and made this case to Eliza and Homer over a dinner in which she presented 3 separate arguments and responded to every counterargument with logical precision. Homer met Eliza's eyes across the table and she met his, and they both worked very hard to keep their expressions appropriate to a serious conversation, rather than to the laughter they were both containing. Clara went to Carson City the following fall as well. which meant that the homestead was, for the first time in years, significantly quieter on most days. Thomas, who was 1 year old and then 2 and then 3, occupied a great deal of space for a small person, but the particular boisterous daily noise of 2 older children was absent during the school months, and the house settled into a different rhythm, still full, still warm, still entirely alive, but calmer. Homer found, somewhat to his surprise, that he did not mind the quieter rhythm at all. He had grown up in a quiet house, the second of 2 children, with a father who was a schoolteacher in Ohio and a mother who read constantly, and the quality of silence in a house that is occupied by people who simply like being in it was not uncomfortable to him. He and Eliza could sit in the evening with Thomas in his small chair between them and the stove going and the desert dark outside, and the sounds of the mine having wound down for the day, and it was complete. He was aware, in a way he had not always been aware of things about himself, of exactly how complete it was. In 1883, they hired a full-time mine manager to oversee the daily operations. A man named Arroyo who had worked in the Comstock lode for years and knew his work intimately, which freed Homer to step back from the day-to-day physical management and return, in a form, to the precise analytical work he loved best. He set up a proper assay laboratory in the expanded workshop, more fully equipped than his old office in town, and he did the assay work for the Chandler Hayes mine, and also, gradually, for other claim holders in the area, because the closure of his old office had left a gap, and because he was better at the work than anyone else within reasonable distance. Eliza watched this development with quiet satisfaction. She had always known, in the careful, reading way she had of knowing things about people, that the assay work was not just what Homer did, but what he was, that the precision and the measurement and the chemical patience of it were an expression of his character in the same way that her own precision with numbers and her steady, forward-looking management of the mine were expressions of hers. They were, in the most fundamental sense, very well matched. Not in the way of 2 people who are alike. They were different in temperament and background and the particular flavor of their intelligence, but in the way of 2 people whose differences reinforce rather than erode each other. His patience made space for her decisiveness. Her decisiveness made use of his patience. His depth gave weight to her clarity. Her clarity illuminated his depth. Thomas walked at 13 months and talked in complete sentences at 18, which he inherited from no particular source but simply decided to do. And he grew into a sunny, energetic child who was fascinated by horses and by the sound of the stamp mill, and by everything Clara told him, which Clara told him constantly during the months she was home from school. The family fell into the rhythms of a well-built life. The school terms and the returns, the summers of work and warmth, the winters of deep quiet and firelight, and the long productive evenings at the parlor table. In the spring of 1884, Eliza realized she was expecting again. This time she told Homer at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning with Thomas in his chair eating porridge, and Homer set down his coffee cup and looked at her and then looked at Thomas and then looked back at her, and his face made the same expression it had made the first time, entirely open and entirely present. "Good morning," he said, with a warmth in his voice that made it something quite different from a greeting. "Good morning," she said, and smiled at him over the table. The second child came in November of 1884, a daughter. They named her Ruth after Homer's mother, who had died when Homer was 19, and whom he rarely spoke of but clearly carried with him. When he held Ruth for the first time in the bedroom of the cabin where he had been holding Eliza's hand for the past several hours and looked at the small, serious face that seemed to be looking right back at him with unnerving focus, he was quiet for a long time. "She looks like she's already calculating something," Eliza said from the bed, her voice tired but warm. "She does," Homer agreed. He looked up. "Thank you. I think we both contributed," Eliza said. "For all of it," he said. "Not just today, for all of it." She looked at him with the full weight of 5 years of built love, of shared work and shared difficulty and shared joy, of mornings and evenings, and the particular intimacy of two people who have built something real together and know the exact measure of what it is. "Homer," she said. "Eliza," he said. And in the warm November afternoon, with the mine running steadily outside and the desert winter beginning to settle over the Nevada hills, the family of Homer and Eliza Hayes was complete, and the life they had built was solid and full and genuinely theirs. The years settled into themselves with the particular grace of time that is well used. Samuel came home from Carson City in 1886, now 15 and already planning to study mining engineering properly, having decided that what he had learned informally from Homer was the beginning of a serious education and not the end of one. Homer spent a summer helping him prepare for the examination required to enter the engineering program in San Francisco, and when Samuel passed it first in his cohort on the practical assay examination, Homer's reaction was the quietest and most genuine pride Eliza had ever seen in a human face. Clara came home definitively in 1887, at 14, full of opinions and arguments and a quality of forward energy that seemed entirely ungovernable from the outside, and that Eliza recognized, with some private amusement, as a more extroverted version of her own relentless internal drive. Clara had decided she wanted to study law, which was an ambition that most people in Rattlesnake Creek received with polite skepticism, and which Eliza received with the calm certainty that her daughter would do exactly what she had decided to do, and that the people who were skeptical would eventually need to revise their assessment. "Whitfield says there is a woman practicing law in San Francisco," Eliza told Homer one evening after a dinner conversation about Clara's plans. "Does he think it's possible?" Homer asked. "He thinks it's possible for the right person," Eliza said. "He also thinks Clara is the right person, which he told her directly, which I think was the most useful thing anyone has said to her in recent memory." Homer considered this. "She is," he said. "She is," Eliza agreed. Thomas, who was 5 in 1886 and 7 in 1888, grew into himself with the particular ease of a child who is both loved and given genuine space. He had Homer's quietness and Eliza's eyes, and an interest in horses that eventually, practically, resolved itself into a genuine expertise. He knew horses with the intuitive, total knowledge that some people develop for certain things, and he spent his early years as useful in the corral as his older brother was in the assay laboratory. Ruth grew into her first impression. She was calculating in the best sense, a child who watched and thought before she moved, who had Homer's precision and her own particular warmth that expressed itself not in effusion, but in the very specific and considered ways she paid attention to people. She and Thomas were close in the way of siblings who are genuinely similar in temperament, and they moved through the homestead with a self-sufficient companionship that was a pleasure to observe. In 1889, Nevada applied for statehood, which prompted a great deal of discussion in Rattlesnake Creek and across the territory. Eliza and Homer sat on the porch on the evening the news came and talked about it for a long time, what it would mean for property rights, for mining law, for the complicated legal landscape that had been their professional and personal territory for a decade. "Better law," Homer said. "In theory, clearer jurisdiction." "Better law for some people," Eliza said carefully. He was quiet, understanding what she meant. The Chinese workers who had built much of the railroad across Nevada and who remained in the territory had no rights that the law was inclined to protect with any consistency. The Paiute and Washoe people whose land this had been before any homestead or mining claim existed were living under conditions of dispossession that Nevada statehood would do nothing to correct and might worsen. Eliza had been aware of this injustice for years in the practical, concrete way that someone is aware of a thing they see with their own eyes and cannot pretend not to see, and she and Homer had talked about it before, In the honest way, they talked about things that were uncomfortable. "What can we do?" he had asked years ago. "What is within our reach?" she had said, and refused to pretend the rest isn't there. In practice, this meant things like paying fair wages to every worker on the mine operation, regardless of background, at a time when wage discrimination by race was entirely standard in the territory. It meant that when a Paiute man named Crow Feather had come to the property line in 1883 asking for water for himself and his horse, Homer had walked him to the well and invited him to rest. And the conversation that followed had led to a working arrangement in which Crow Feather, who knew the high desert terrain better than any man alive, provided information about water sources and geological formations that proved genuinely valuable to the mine operation. Paid for at a rate that reflected the value of the knowledge, it was not enough. Eliza knew that. The injustice was structural and vast, and the gestures available to two people running a mine in the Nevada desert were small in proportion to it. But small things done consistently were better than nothing done at all, and nothing done at all was the easier choice, and therefore the one they refused. Nevada became a state in 1864, which meant that by the time Eliza and Homer's conversation on the porch happened in 1889, it had been a state for 25 years, and they were discussing the practical legal changes accompanying the growing settler population and the solidifying of property and commercial law. Homer observed that the legal framework had become more predictable over the decade, which was useful for their operation. Eliza observed that it had become more predictable for people with claims who already held power, which was a different kind of observation. "You should have been a lawyer," Homer said. "Clara will be a lawyer," Eliza said. "That's the better outcome." He smiled. "You'll have to explain to her how many of these conversations you had before she decided on the profession." "I expect she already knows," Eliza said. He laughed quietly in the desert evening, and she leaned against his shoulder, and the stars were very large and very close overhead, the way they always were in the Nevada high desert, and the stamp mill was quiet for the night, and the horses moved in the corral in the easy, restless way of horses settling into darkness. By 1890, the Chandler Hayes mine had been producing steadily for a decade. It was not the largest operation in Nevada. It was not meant to be, but it was one of the most consistently profitable per ton of ore extracted, which Homer took some professional satisfaction in, and the combination of silver and gold production had given them a financial stability that seemed almost improbable against the memory of the struggling homestead, the 2 horses sold, the sewing taken in through the winter. They had expanded the original cabin twice, and it was now a proper house, 4 bedrooms, a proper parlor with a bookcase that had been Homer's first large purchase when the mine began producing real returns, a kitchen large enough for the large meals that occurred whenever all 4 children were home. The workshop had grown into a proper outbuilding with Homer's assay laboratory on one side and the mine's administrative office on the other, where Eliza spent her working mornings with the ledgers and correspondence. The property had changed in the way that tended land changes. The fences repaired and kept up now. The garden Eliza had put in the second year established and mature. The trees she had planted when Thomas was born now tall enough to give real shade on the south side of the house. It was a place that had been worked and loved for 15 years, and it looked like what it was. Eliza stood in the doorway of the kitchen one morning in the early spring of 1890 and looked out at all of it, the garden, the trees, the corral where Thomas was working with the horses, the mine workings in the middle distance with Arroyo already overseeing the morning shift, and behind her she could hear Homer in the assay lab, the careful sounds of a man at precise and absorbing work, and from upstairs she could hear Ruth, who was 5 now and had discovered that the upper window gave an excellent view of everything, narrating what she observed to no one in particular. She looked at all of it for a long time in the morning light. What had begun with a canvas sack and a calculated gamble and an honest man at a counter had become this. A life fully built, fully inhabited, fully hers and theirs and shared, out of the hard desert ground that had given up its silver and gold to a woman who had bothered to look carefully, who had come to the right place with the right questions, who had been willing to trust what she found there. She thought of the day she had walked into the Assay office alone. Every man in that room had looked through her. She had left with the knowledge that would change everything, and the receipt for $2 folded in her pocket, and the beginning of something that she had not known yet was a beginning. She had left with more than every man in the room combined. She had left with the Assay report and the legal foundation and the professional partnership that had become a personal one. She had left with a future that was genuinely open. She had left with the beginning of Homer Hayes, who was in the next room right now, measuring something with characteristic precision, and who was the best thing the Nevada desert had offered her, better than silver, better than gold, better than the particular satisfaction of a fight won on legally defensible ground. She was aware of footsteps behind her and felt his presence before she heard him. The way she always knew when he came into a room, not dramatically, not with any kind of announcement, but with the simple, quiet alteration of a space that has become so familiar that the person has become part of the atmosphere of it. He stood behind her in the doorway and looked out at the same view. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. His hands settled on her shoulders, warm through her dress, and she leaned back slightly against him, and they stood together in the doorway looking at the life they had built from a fence post hole and an honest transaction, and two people who had been careful enough to be sure. Thomas ran up from the corral, breathless, to tell them about something one of the horses had done that he considered remarkable, and he stood in the yard below the doorway with his 8-year-old face tilted up, and his boots muddy and his voice full of the earnest excitement of a child reporting genuinely important news. And Homer listened to every word with the complete attention he brought to things that mattered. Ruth appeared on the landing behind them, descended the stairs, pushed past both of them in the doorway with complete unceremonious determination, and went to stand beside Thomas to evaluate the horse situation with her own eyes. Eliza smiled. Homer's hands on her shoulders were warm and unhurried and entirely certain. The desert morning light came over the hills and lay across the homestead, the mine, the garden, the trees, the corral, the house that had been built and expanded and lived in, and it was very ordinary and very full and completely, genuinely, enough. In the years that came after, the children grew into themselves and away and back in the recurring pattern of family life. Samuel returned from San Francisco with a mining engineering degree and worked with Homer on several improvements to the mine's extraction process, and eventually left for Colorado to pursue his own career, writing long letters home that were full of technical detail and quiet pride. Clara did go to San Francisco to study law, and the people who had been skeptical did eventually revise their assessment, and she came home to Nevada in 1895 and opened a practice in Carson City that was notable for the quality of its work, and for the particular ferocity with which it defended clients whom more prominent practices declined to take seriously. She visited the homestead often, always arriving with a document case under her arm and strong opinions about everything, and Homer's expression when she arrived was always the same fond, patient, slightly amused expression of a man who has been very thoroughly fond of a strong-willed person for a long time. Thomas grew up to be exactly what he had shown signs of being, a man who understood horses with a completeness that was more than skill, who eventually built his own operation on land adjacent to his mother's homestead, breeding horses that were known throughout the territory for their soundness and temperament. He married a woman named Lucia in 1901, a schoolteacher from Reno who shared his quietness, and matched it with a warmth that made the whole family's collective temperature rise the first time she came to dinner, And they had 3 children of their own who ran freely between both properties, and were spoiled in the particular careful way of grandparents who know that spoiling done right is indistinguishable from love. Ruth became what she had always been, a person of extraordinary precision and attention, and turned it toward medicine, studying with a physician in Carson City and then San Francisco, and returning to Nevada to practice in an era when women in medicine were still subject to constant resistance, that she met with the same measured, implacable determination she had brought to everything since the age of 3 months. She never married by choice and was entirely content in that choice, and no one in her family tried to revise her position on it after the first attempt, which she handled with such complete and devastating clarity that everyone understood immediately that the discussion was permanently closed. And Homer and Eliza, in the house on the homestead that had been expanded and improved and thoroughly occupied for going on 2 decades, continued the life they had built in the precise and beautiful way that 2 people continue a life when they have chosen it completely and keep choosing it. He still worked in the Assay laboratory every morning. She still managed the financial correspondence and the mine accounts every morning. In the afternoons they were often in the same space, working on different things, in the productive and comfortable silence they had developed over 20 years of shared dailiness. In the evenings they sat on the porch in the summers and by the stove in the winters, and they talked about everything: the children, the mine, the books they were reading, the events of the territory and beyond, the ongoing complicated moral landscape of the West. And they did not always agree, and they were always honest, and they always came back to the same comfortable, certain ground. He still sometimes looked at her from across the room with that expression she had first seen in the kitchen on the night the vein was found open, present, everything showing plain. She still responded to it with the smile that was not the careful, composed expression she showed the world but the real one, sudden and bright and entirely her. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole, specific, irreplaceable thing. The mine ran for 30 years from its first production, outlasting many Nevada operations of the same period, because it had been developed carefully and managed honestly, and never overextended or exploited beyond what the ore body could sustain. When it finally declined in the early 1900s, the grade dropping below profitable range, the vein pinching out at depth as veins eventually do, Homer wrote the final assay report himself, by the same careful method he had used on the first 9 samples, and presented it to Eliza at the kitchen table with the same directness with which he had presented the preliminary results 25 years earlier. She read it and looked up. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. They sat with it for a moment, the 2 of them in the kitchen that had been their kitchen for so long that it was not possible to think of it as belonging to any other time. "We did well by it," Homer said. "We did," she said. "And it did well by us." She put the report down and looked across the table at him, the same gray-green eyes behind wire spectacles, the hands permanently stained from decades of chemical work, the quiet, deliberate manner that had not changed except to deepen and become more fully itself as the years had filled it in. He was 60 years old. She was 56. The children were grown and living their own full lives. The house was settled and warm, and full of the accumulated weight of years of occupancy. The desert outside was exactly as it had always been: vast, beautiful, indifferent, and occasionally given to extraordinary generosity for those who looked at it with the right kind of attention. "No regrets?" he asked. "None," she said immediately. "You?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that was not hesitation but genuine consideration, because that was who he was and always had been, a man who considered before he answered. "None," he said. "Not one." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned it and held it in the warm, firm, unhurried way he had been holding her hand for more than 20 years. And outside the Nevada morning was beginning, and the horses moved in the corral, and somewhere across the property Thomas's eldest was already calling for something. a child's voice high and clear in the desert air. And the world was wide and ordinary and exactly as it should be.